Nizar Hasan, welcome to Al Rawiya, the podcast.
Hello, thank you.
So, Nizar, you're a researcher in public policy and social movements. وكمان you're a presenter and producer at Tafkeek, which is a YouTube channel that aims at teaching people some notions about sociology or the society and economics, and I guess unpacking these different notions. How did you get to doing Tafkeek? What was the idea behind it?
All right. So I've been interested in things related to generally how resources are distributed for a long time. I felt this need to understand ليش في ناس غنية وناس فقراء وهيك قصص. It was never based on primarily on شو تعلمت بالجامعة لأنه أنا تعلمت political science without any emphasis on economics. بس أخذت كورس واحد وما كان هالقد interesting, كان كتير boring وصف فيه 300 شخص وما حدا عم يفهم شيء. So after I graduated and started working, I felt I don't understand basic economics, and I understood بعدين most people don't understand anything about economics. بعدين فهمت لأنه الإيكونومكس كتير فيها كلمات صعبين وجارجن خاص فيها. الconversation صعب تصير إذا حدا حاسس ما عنده tools تبع الconversation. بس actually conversation about economic things and resources and how they are distributed and inequality and these things عم بيصيروا كل الوقت in public discourse بالفضاء العام, in other disciplines like sociology and in politics, etc. But it's considered as a separate thing. And if you look at the politics, especially for example in Lebanon, it's a good example. ربينا على فكرة الاقتصاد والسياسة شغلتين مختلفين عن بعض. So سياسة بمحل هي who's in power and who's winning elections and who's like rotating بالسلطة وهيك قصص. الاقتصاد هو شيء بيعملوه التكنوقراطس والهاف تكنوقراطس هولي مثل وزراء المالية اللي ما نون كتير politicians بيكونوا هيك عندهم رياض سلامة, عنده vibe private sector ومرتب وهيك تكنوقراط بيشتغل اقتصاد. So most of the people are like, we don't need to interfere in economics, it's a profession. So مثل ما عنا chemical engineers بيكون عنا economists. And that's really problematic. And the more I read about economics, the more I understood that smart economists don't even accept this as a notion. They don't accept that economics actually is a science. They know that the theories وكل شيء مكتوب بالeconomics مكتوب based on certain fundamental ideology about how you see the world. And if you look at the same situation from two different lenses, واحدة بتقول like trying to describe reality and another one trying to say okay what should be done, you see how both of them are directly related to each other. So if we understand the problem differently رح يكون عنا different solutions. And that's why politics is actually at the heart of economics, and why people like Lenin called politics like intensified economics, because it's really all about distribution of resources and power in society. So that's what got me interested in this. And then when I had more of like the time to do it without being, without having to have to work in like two jobs or whatever, and when I got to a point where I was able to secure like a fellowship that allowed me to work on my own project, I was like, okay, it's time to try to do it. It took a couple of years صراحة لأنه there were many ideas, but the main point is just to make the economic conversation a bit more accessible, a bit more democratic, like for people not to be ashamed to discuss economic things even if they haven't studied it, because at the end how many people have studied economics?
There's this problem أصلاً بهول spheres where they make هيك مواضيع unattainable because of the terms that they use, when in reality you can simplify them and you can include all these different people in this conversation.
Yeah.
For that being said, خلينا نفكك شوي الأزمة الاقتصادية اللي هلأ عم بتصير بلبنان. شو هي الامباكت تبعها؟ شو عم بيصير؟ شو صاير هلأ من 2019 لهلأ؟
Yeah, okay, so the crisis in Lebanon didn't start in 2019. It was basically إذا بدنا نقول free fall, الكولابس اللي هو عم نشوفه من 2019. من قبل كان في a crisis in economic terms, والeconomists كانوا عارفينه. So من 2011 بلش يخرب equilibrium معين موجود بالاقتصاد, اللي هو قد ايه بيفوت مصاري على لبنان, funding this whole economy, an economic model that we have. في كتير ناس بيحكوا عنه انه هو it's not a productive economy, بيسموه بالعربي الاقتصاد الريعي او the rentier economy in English. And the point is basically the way money is accumulated in Lebanon has been focused on certain sectors, and this was not sustainable on the long term. So there was not enough basically pure deposits coming in بس as savings and remittances to save the economy on the long term. إذا ما عم ننتج, we're not producing enough value and exporting it outside. So the main idea is just about how productive an economy is and can it handle its dependency on foreign products constantly. Economically can it handle it? Can it be في balance بينه وبين الاقتصاد السوق? Sorry. Basically it's a question of whether there's a balance between your market and the global market in a way or another. This crisis has extended into kind of a free fall where most of the policies that should have been done on day one have been either pushed or reversed completely. Basically no policy has been actually achieved. No policy has been enacted in Lebanon to deal with the economic crisis. We're talking 4 years now after it started. And that's the craziest part about this economic crisis. So we're watching it as it happens in the most organic way with some manipulation من السلطة but not enough intervention, completely inactive authorities. And that was exactly sadly that was the point behind the way that this economic crisis has been managed. The point was إذا ما بنتدخل أبدا كدولة كل الناس بيفقروا شوي, بيفقروا كتير, بس الاقتصاد كله كمان بيفقر منيح. So بيصير بيوطى حجم ال expectations تبع العالم, حجم المدخول تبعهم, كل شيء. هذا الشيء بحرر البنوك من their deposits which were the biggest burden. And then بنفس الوقت بيخلي انه the question I was talking about قبل اللي اسمها current account balance, قد عم بيفوت مصاري وقد عم يطلع من لبنان, ترجع to balance لأنه people can't afford the stuff they were affording before. That's so the change is not a balance for improvement إنه طلع الستاندرد. No, وطى الستاندرد so that everyone is poorer cannot actually fund their previous lifestyles, and therefore Lebanon is importing less. That was the point. That was Riyad Salam's plan, and that's why he stayed so long, and that's why he had to leave, because it cannot go on forever and not be there was this plan of doing nothing as a policy for the ruling class in Lebanon. And this is manifested in basically impoverishment of almost everyone. If we're talking about like how different groups in society have been affected, we see that mostly, regardless of the question of whether you've been affected or not is not valid. The question is basically how much and what kind of new situation are you in? Are you now like in dire poverty, postponing meals, which is like a significant percentage of the population now compared to before? Are you not able to fund certain luxuries but managing, etc. So we get كل الناس تأثروا, بس مش كل الناس بنفس الطريقة. If you're a worker, if you're a owner of a company, it's a different experience. So yeah.
في هلا كتير عم بيقولوا انه الطبقة الوسطى الميدل كلاس صغرت والطبقة العاملة كبرت. شو رأيك بهيدا هالجملة اللي بيقولوها؟
Yeah. So we used to say انه في بلبنان طبقة وسطى. It's true in terms of consumption انه في ناس كتير بلبنان كانوا قادرين يصرفوا اكتر من البيسكس, وكانوا معاشاتهم اعلى من compared to some other countries internationally. كانوا معاشاتنا اعلى شوي لانه we had this policy of pegging the lira to the dollar, which itself when it collapsed it caused the whole crisis. So the way that the Lebanese system economic model has subsidized life or made people think that they are middle class is just by exaggerating their salaries through basically economic policy sponsored by the central bank and the private banks. That's how they maintained a level of security, perceived security and perceived social mobility. So صار العالم حاسين حالهم, مثلا أهلي حسوا حالهم كتير أحسن بعد الحرب الأهلية أو بعد خلصت الحرب الأهلية وصار في كتير deposits ومصاري أكتر عم بتفوت بلبنان. تحسنوا معاشاتهم. At some point كانوا كتير أكتر فقراء فشافوا إنه في actual difference. على سبيل المثال, وفي كتير ناس صار معهم شيء شبيه كتير. بس الحقيقة اللي كان عم بيصير هو بكل بساطة إنه regardless of شو الشغل عم تشتغليه internationally, شو بأي قطاع عم تشتغلي, أو regardless of قديش فيه قديش productive هذا السيكتور عم بيطلع مصاري بطريقة enough لتحسي حالك إنه أنت different than other workers. So for example, if you're working in a bank, you used to be considered middle class. And يعني no one working in a bank would consider themselves working class the same way that they wouldn't say إنه هن والشخص اللي بيعطيهم ساندويش ببربر هن نفس الطبقة. You know, like it wouldn't occur to them. هلا بهاللحظة they are almost in super similar conditions, different work times, different benefits. Okay, بس إنه and if you look at how much they can actually spend and stuff like that, sometimes هلا in many cases being a waiter is as good as being I don't know, senior bank employee.
بس البرستيج ما بيسمح لهم هلا يقولوا انه نحن مثل مثلا حدا who's waiting tables او حدا عم بيعطينا هالساندويش ببربر. بعد في هيدا social connotation behind it that says انه لا we're still different.
Yeah, في شيء fundamentally بيأثر على كيف الانسان بيشوف حاله كبارت من طبقة or not اكثر من actually is وين موقعه الاجتماعي. يعني اذا انا وياك اثنيناتنا عنا let's say the things that allow us to get a job بس ما عنا actually capital or wealth enough to start a company, so we are both waiting for someone to hire us. So إذا في حدا بوظفنا بتصير حياتنا أحسن, إذا ما حدا وظفنا بنموت من الجوع. That's the situation, and that's the situation of most workers. So even if your salary is high, it doesn't matter. You're still waiting. You're still depending on the idea إنه في حدا رح يدفع لك حق عدد الساعات اللي عم تشتغليهم. And these are just called like the working class. حتى لو بيلبسوا تياب كتير حلوين وبيقعدوا بالAC وبيشتغلوا على الكمبيوتر, still working class. It's just that the tools have changed. The means of الاشياء اللي كانت تعمل مصاري قبل هي the mines and the factories. هلا القصص بتعمل مصاري ممكن تكون بكل بساطة مكتب صغير بشقة ببناية كلها أزاز. It doesn't matter. It's still the same dynamic of work, and what you own is still the same. Your body and your ability to work.
صح. And you said إنه في مثلا عالم عندها عالم يمكن تعتبر حالها من الميدل كلاس عندها access لقصص يمكن العالم اللي هن بيعتبرون بس بالطبقة العاملة بالworking class ما عندهم إياها. شو هن هو الشغلات؟
Let's say mostly I think it's things like having an educational degree, having maybe a house, or being part of or knowing that you have a house coming to أو شيء من هالنوع. But primarily أنا what I saw in my experience was education. People who get an education, unless they spend many years looking for a job and not finding one, people who have an education degree seem to usually identify as middle class, which is again funny لأنه while there are classes of workers for sure, and there are differences between workers. أكيد مش كل الناس اللي بيبيعوا وقتهم نفس الشيء لأنه عم يعمل لأنه حدا بيقبض $10,000 حدا بيقبض 200, مش نفس الشيء, right? Completely different lifestyle. But most people who call themselves middle class are just workers who happen to be having a good deal for a while, mostly. Apart from that, it's true that education and experience gets you more opportunities in the future. So if you don't have an education, you are more likely to stay poor throughout your life, and more likely to associate with being poor and to identify as someone who accepts this idea and that they are poor, because your experiences are going to places and then telling you, no, sorry, you don't have a degree, so we're not going to hire you, for example. So it's real. At the same time, it's perceived, because when the crisis happened, الحدا مثل أمي, she worked really hard. She went to university. She started university at like 30 something years old because she wanted to have a career in teaching sociology. So she studied really hard at an old age after she had many kids, and it was like a long journey to get to a point where she's getting a salary. She was a public school teacher. So when she worked throughout these years, she got to a point where her salary was like good enough, a middle class salary, especially that my dad left he lost his job and then he passed away. So she had a solid kind of background in the she had a solid kind of basis for spending and for having a middle class life, which is $2,000 from the state. Okay, هلا صارت الأزمة صاروا $30. Okay, it's the exact same salary. So automatically هي راحت من إذا بدنا نطلع على المجتمع numerically as like a list of people in classes based on how much they make. Automatically you see that you know, she's no longer middle class. She's like the poor of the poor, you know, the poorest of the poor. عشوائي شو $30 بالشهر. It's impossible to live on according to any standard. Like $1 a day per person is considered يعني not even close to enough to survive anywhere right now. So the real poverty wage is closer to $5 per day. So I'm just giving this as an example of someone completely losing their so-called middle class status immediately after a financial crisis happens, and maybe it's going to be really hard for her to recover that because she's a public sector employee and her salaries are fixed and dependent on laws and decrees and stuff like that for many reasons. And also people who were in the private sectors either lost their jobs altogether. Companies closed, many companies closed in Lebanon in the last few years, or their incomes now are ridiculously low. In some cases, people can't get in their car to go to work anymore because it's not worth it, transportation versus salary. And this was the case with many teachers and many people working in retail, and that's why we had many strikes as well in the recent years, because people can't make enough to just go to work, which is absolutely ridiculous. Like, not, and Spinneys right now is paying like less than $400. Just to give an example of like actually the salaries in the private economy and the private sector اللي بيحكوا عنه دايما التكنوقراطس انه هو الحل, انه private sector right now is as bad as the public sector in terms of how it's handling it.
Yeah, so I think as a result we've seen that the typical Lebanese worker, or these people who had these jobs that were considered according to these standards middle class, are now looking for work in the informal market. They're looking for more manual labor. So we see with tuttors for example انه عنا كتير عالم بالجيش هلا عم بيشتغلوا كمان مع tuttors. So I guess عم نشوف هود الداينامكس كيف عم بيتغيروا. من قبل كانوا العالم يفكروا انه مثلا اللاجئات واللاجئين السورية هن اكتر بيشتغلوا بالانفورمال ماركت, بس هلا عم نشوف اللبنانية اكتر عم بيخرقوا هول الماركتس in a more noticeable way. We've seen this major dynamic shift, and I don't know if society is really catching up to that dynamic shift, or they're still trying to, you know, keep it on the low.
What you're saying is really important for many reasons. أول شيء, the people who used to work in formal sectors and formal jobs are now working informally. Informally, في many definitions of informal work, but I'm basically saying informal as in someone whose work is not protected by either a real contract or some other benefits like health insurance, pension, etc., retirement savings, holos. So informal work in Lebanon has been increasing steadily مع the rise of the internet, very clearly. But in the last 3 years, we've seen an incredible increase. I think it's now one of the most informal economies. It's around 62% of the economy is informal, meaning 62% of workers تقريبا. I'm not on workers, not companies. 62% of workers are working without solid benefits, without health insurance, without daman, social security. And people who do have social security have lost all the actual benefits of social security. So again, my mother is a state employee. She used to have another thing similar to the social security, the National Social Security Fund. There's another thing for public sector workers called the Civil Servant Co-op, تعاونية موظفين الدولة. And it offers the same. It offers a different package, but it covers more. It gives more benefits and better health insurance and all of these things than the daman. And it still lost all of its benefits during the Thawra. So a lot of what makes your life affordable, things that are outside of your wage. حكينا عن قد the wages dropped. بس كمان the benefits and the services, the fact that they dropped so much. نشيل subsidies كل subsidies عن الانرجي. صرنا عم ندفع extremely high energy costs. بنفس الوقت نشيل any subsidies on medications and wheat and all of these things, important things that basically used to kind of make life a bit more affordable. But most importantly, I think the collapse is seen in education and in health, because people can't afford good schools and good health care anymore. They have to rely on private insurance, which is really expensive. كتير فيها conditions وكتير فيها exploitation من قبل الشركات.
يعني فمثل ما شفنا مثلا بقصة الانرجي, لأنه الدولة اللبنانية ما عم تقدر تلبي هيدي الحاجة, عم بيضطروا العالم شو يروحوا عند الموتورات ويدفعوا كل هالمصاري. وقت it comes to health insurance, لأنه في كتير عالم ما عم بيقدروا يتكفلوا تحت الضمان, عم يضطروا يفتشوا على private insurance. So هالباترن اللي عم نشوفها هي إنه في public problems that are being I guess fixed by private solutions. So problems جاية من الدولة وهي بالمبدأ بدولة مفروض الدولة تتكفل بهالشيء، بس العالم هن عم يفتشوا على solutions which in my opinion يمكن it levels down the responsibility على الدولة، بس كمان إنه العالم بدها تعيش بآخر النهار ما فيهم ينطروا للدولة تجي وتقول لهم خلص نحن رح نعملكم هيك رح نعملكم هيك، لأنه ما عم بيعملوا شيء.
Yeah. One thing common among everyone, I think, every human being wants to live a better life.
صح.
Regardless of how they define it. And there's a lot in common between this you know, this is a universal feeling that it's a persistent thing that, you know, humans have regardless إذا ظروفنا عم تتحسن أو عم بتسوء. في this urge to make it a bit better. So people find ways, and that's normal in any crisis. The problem here is that there's only private solutions, and that's it. So, which means that everything is way more unequal than before. As you mentioned, like, if we talk about energy, we see that basically the crisis was that the state used to pay $1.5 billion in subsidies to make energy cheaper. That was the point. It was not corruption and waste in EDL bus and the electricity company. It was subsidies. And this is an official policy that the state does in order to make electricity cheaper. Why did they maintain these subsidies all these years? Because they're not giving us real electricity. So that was a situation where they're not giving us a lot of electricity, but we're not paying any real money for it, let's say. Okay? And now we're in a situation where we're still getting that limited electricity, but we're paying much more for it, and we're getting less than before. So we have to rely on other sources of electricity. Most people have اشتراك motor, you know, they subscribe to the local generator, and then they pay really high fees depending on قديش بيحرموا حالهم or لا. Honestly, like the real coping mechanisms that we see in this area in terms of health, in terms of energy, in terms of education and nutrition are really scary. So people postpone their surgeries, they avoid tests, they don't subscribe to health insurance لأنه هلا بطل de facto بطل في real support من الدولة. So كلنا بدنا either health insurance or no insurance, right? This is the real situation right now. So everyone has to spend all of this and to make a lot of choices in like where to spend your money. Should I buy food or should I buy a medication that's kind of optional? Like that's a question that's gonna be has been very relevant for a lot of people. And these choices كلهم عندهم تبعات كتير خطرة collective. You know, if people don't eat well, they're gonna be sick. You know, it's a social problem. People being sick and people needing support is care. It's not a private issue, it's a collective thing, you know, and we saw that in COVID most clearly. Like إذا حدا مرض معه COVID ما بنعطيه treatment إذا هو فقير لا right لأنه صار الفقير فيه يعد الغني so صاروا equal right. So صار في فجأة صار في this sense of equality, like everyone should have healthcare, and right now no one has healthcare, which is except for like 7% of the population who are right now covered by private insurance. 7%. It used to be 51%. Really bad, but better than 7. The number of people who are actually covered, fully covered, or partially at least covered by health insurance. لأنه كان في كتير ناس بالضمان. It's the main insurer in Lebanon, and now it hasn't been خسروا مصرياتهم ضمان مثل أي مؤسسة تانية. So now it hasn't been able to offer this support. Pushing people more and more towards private solutions, and we see political parties trying to exploit that. A couple of political parties from opposing sides, يعني كتايب وحزب الله, have been involved recently in like health insurance schemes to replace الضمان بما إنه الضمان مش ماشي.
So بالمبدأ بينتسبوا لهود political parties as a result they
no
get
officially not right.
Okay.
It's just connected to them بس.
Okay.
In reality we know how clientelism works.
Yeah.
And how it's reinforced. And people need the solutions regardless. إذا حدا بيقول لي إنه في health insurance like half of what I pay, I would be happy to join that, you know.
أكيد. I mean بآخر النهار you have to survive, you know.
And sorry, and we talked about energy, but in energy specifically, after we saw all of this crazy energy poverty and people depriving themselves of mazout وكهرباء etc. in order to live, or not showering so much because they live in a cold area and they can't use the water heater so much. We saw a move towards this private solution of solar panels, which is, you know, better than, I guess, private generators بالبيت in terms of pollution and stuff like that. And safety. Still super expensive to do it on an individual basis.
Yeah.
It's still really, really wasteful because most of these solar panels are not connected to, are not giving electricity to anyone who needs it when they're not using it.
Yeah.
It's just being wasted in this small, very, very small system. So you would see a building that has different panels for different floors and stuff like that. It's so fragmented. It's like every nuclear household has its own power plant now, which is, you know, I had to do as well, like because the alternative is not sustainable on the long term and is worse. But it's a crazy kind of solution to the idea that no one has electricity, that each person spends $5,000-$6,000 on like a system for their house or whatever.
Yeah, they're creating these private solutions. And another private solution that I can think about is remittances. So تحويل المصاري من برا على لبنان. عم نسمع هلا كتير انه كأنه كل شخص هون بلبنان او كل عائلة بلبنان عندها شخص برا عم بيحولوا له المصاري. شو القضية وراها هيدا كله؟ شو هن remittances؟ كيف عم بيعيشوا العالم؟ Is it sustainable?
Yeah, remittances have been really important in the Lebanese economy لكذا سبب. But mainly because people who have are looking for high-paying jobs and skilled jobs that kind of offer career opportunities of you know, improvement or more specialization. Find it almost impossible. في كذا سبب ليش الناس كتير بيفلوا من لبنان غير لما كان في حرب بعد الحرب. But primarily I think the main reason has been the lack of specialized work that allows people to have the careers that they got their education based on, and they imagine these careers and they're not possible in Lebanon. So that's why in the past most engineers used to travel outside Lebanon, and we didn't really question that. But except for civil engineers, no one had work in Lebanon. A mechanical engineer has nothing to do in this country except if they want to work in something that they are much more that they are not like trained for, they are overqualified for, etc. And then you have other cases where people just apply to immigration when it's easier, but these are more exception. So generally poor families aren't the ones who kind of export most their people outside. It's basically what we were calling the middle class before, people who have an education, who believe that they have, you know, more potential and stuff, that travel outside. هلا صار situation a bit different because بعد الأزمة صار remittances are much more important than before, because now local money is not the same at all as international money. So the $200 that they send you from outside became something real that they can support you throughout the month for a while. Now it's not anymore. But it became something really important for like the survival of families. And already before the crisis, a significant percentage of families had someone outside. Now it's increasing dramatically. My own family has been completely dispersed in the last 3 years. So now like I have siblings in different continents and stuff like that. It wasn't the case before, and I wasn't really expecting it to happen. None of them really wanted to leave. That's the point. It's just that you leave or you work for almost no money. This is the new situation, and the remittances are also a way of funding what has been lost in the crisis. For example, if someone needs شو بعرفنا, let's say health insurance again, okay? Someone needs to pay their yearly health insurance because they don't have the money anymore and they regularly have to do tests and stuff like that. If they manage to get a health insurance policy, it's going to be their son abroad or their daughter abroad who's paying it, because who's going to pay out of pocket $2,000 for a yearly policy of health insurance, for example, or $3,000 for older people? So it's clearly now it's like almost the last resort. It's not anymore just a pillar of the system. It's now also kind of the safety net for everyone. And if it's not remittances, it's usually NGO jobs. Similar phenomenon, different phenomenon, but like similar dynamic. It all depends على قد عم ينعمل مصاري برات لبنان وعم بيفوتوا voluntary على لبنان. It's not the same as having a productive economy that's making this income. It's still really dependent on unsustainable and volatile funds.
You know, and the remittances card is being played very strongly. هلا أنا كنت برات البلد قول صار لي 6 أشهر فالة ورجعت وشفت كل هود المحلات they popped up everywhere, you know, Ria, Wish, all these different places. There are applications as well. كأنه إنه they're reinforcing the idea إنه إيه أنتوا برا فيكم تبعتوا مصاري لهون، عم نعمل applications عم بتسهلكم الأمور. So is it really right to say إنه remittances are sustainable for our economy؟ يعني في عالم هلأ كتير عم بتقول إنه خلص remittances tourism منصير الدنيا بألف خير بلبنان. But is that right?
I think remittances have reached their peak already. We're talking about a third of the GDP. That's official numbers, no more like formal estimations. This is not taking into account that most remittances come in suitcases, in cash, in bulks of cash, and they don't come through Western Union and you know these other services, because people want to pay as little as possible to these companies. Rightly so, in my opinion, because these companies are overcharging, most of them. But still, most of the money is coming informally. It's being put in bags, and that means that it's not monitored. We don't know how much that is. It also means that it's really unequal. Again, it's a private solution, again, as you mentioned, because like the amount of remittance that gets to every household can be so dramatically different that you're like, okay, we have to talk about different classes among the people who are getting it becomes a really more nuanced thing when you look at the amount of remittances. Some people own companies abroad and they don't mind sending $2,000 per month, and some people can only spare like 100 or 2, and that's a really, really different kind of support for the family. So you watch the family consumption in Lebanon now, and you can deduce or like you understand the kind of the diaspora money that is the income of the diaspora members of a family abroad, you know.
Yeah, it varies. It's not all the same.
Yeah, and it's not definitely not sustainable in the sense of, I mean, we don't expect that remittances stop abruptly, because this is the most emotional form of economic transaction. In reality, it's a thing based on like mostly kinship and family. So these things tend to be much stronger in crisis, and they are maintained as long as they are needed. They're not like suddenly usually cut, etc. However, what's really happening is that we're funding the life of people in Lebanon through the wages of people abroad. Fundamentally, that's what's happening. So we're not fixing anything about the problem of wages here not being comparatively high, or the fact that people here are not finding the protection they need or the jobs they need. So the main reason is either unemployment and lack of real job opportunities, or the lack of other benefits like health insurance and pension and things like that make people think, okay, I mean, of course I'll go to Germany, at least I can put my kids in school for free. I mean, that's way more important than even making more money per month, you know. That's part of your wage, like the idea that the state is paying for school or healthcare, or you know, the system is organized in a way where you can ensure your dignity on the long term, and you're not going to be like, you know, humiliated by your the various choices, etc. There's a safety net. Here the safety net is non-existent, and instead of creating one through a lot of money that's coming from abroad, we're giving this money. We're not giving this money is coming very precisely to specific individuals based on their the capacities of their children, which is very, very unequal. So whatever economic inequality we used to see in Lebanon before, we don't expect to see any less. And it's already one of the worst countries in the world. Like this, probably the second, third worst country in the world in terms of real distribution of income and wealth. And that's crazy. I mean, it's already a bad situation, but right now it's much more exaggerated.
It makes me think about how, you know, let's say 5, 10, 15 years ago, we used to think, oh, like, yeah, it's pretty bad. But we never, ever, ever thought we'd reach this point. And then there are still some people who don't really want to acknowledge what's going on, or they choose not to. I mean, that's a different conversation on its own. But you did mention childcare and how people look for these private solutions in childcare and so on. And other things that we need or other things that are traditionally, or what we think are traditionally covered by the social welfare systems, are childcare, old age care, so on. But we don't see that in Lebanon. ما إنه مأمن ل كل العيال يمكن إنه ما في هود government funded programs, I guess, if I'm not mistaken. But then we've seen the rise of this alternative care system that we're seeing being created through the kafala system, which is essentially a system based on slavery, which, and I don't like using this word because it's not really right to use it on humans, but quote unquote importing migrant workers to do jobs in Lebanon under very awful conditions. And one of the uses of this system is alternative care systems, I guess, or alternative care means. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think looking at kafala as purely an issue of working conditions and an issue of human rights violation limits the conversation a bit in terms of how we understand it, not in terms of like whether it is those things or not. For sure, it's modern slavery. It's a modern form of slavery, in the sense of lack of freedom of movement, lack of freedom of changing work, which is one of the premises of capitalism, supposedly, that you can leave your job, you can go to a cafe, not have to stay at home and your passport confiscated or whatever. It's really abusive in the sense of like as a form of employment in most cases, right? But primarily it's satisfying a certain social role. So why are we all aware that kafala is really bad, but we all can't tell our mothers seriously, no, you're doing something really bad if you hire a migrant domestic worker at home? Because otherwise we have to be like, instead, why don't you, right?
Yeah.
And what's that alternative? As you're saying, there is no alternative if you don't have childcare that is affordable or free. Healthcare, like nursing homes, are seen as a bad thing across the globe. I think mostly in many societies where like this idea of households making it financially independently is really emphasized, like Lebanon. People feel ashamed about nursing homes, while the idea that people who need physical care because they're old should not live fragmented individually in these different households if they can, benefit from collectivizing a bit, where like they share certain things that make it really expensive to live, The idea that social funding goes to a nursing home we should not be taken for granted. It's a great idea, for example, or for like other things, like for example, as you said, childcare. It's not just childcare. It's not just the children. It's mostly the mothers that have benefited from childcare historically, because they've been able to either have some time or work. In both cases, great outcomes for certain people. It's not like they're not working at home at the same time. That's the thing about capitalism. It doesn't value all work. But at the same time, having childcare, allowing people to have the option of working if they want to, of getting a job, is really important. So when they look at economic statistics in Lebanon and they say, why is the labor force participation of women so low in this country? Yeah, I wonder. The answer is always like culture, right? Culture. And I'm always fascinated by this answer, because there are more conservative societies where women work more outside the house. What's the real reason for this kind of trend here? It's not, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So to me, so for example, the idea of looking at migrant domestic workers as an alternative system of subsidizing this is a process. It's kind of a process in which these workers, their wages are funding the lives of their children or family in their home countries in most cases, and then their wages here are so low comparatively to our needs and to our cost of living that it allows us to pay it even if we are like practically poor. And that was the case before the crisis. Like your monthly income could be $600, and you would still probably decide to spend $100 on a monthly salary of a migrant domestic worker, because it's so much cheaper than paying for healthcare, education, and all of these other things. So in a way, through the lira to dollar peg and through the kafala system and how it really works, we created a fake sense of class and prestige and status for a lot of people, and we subsidized in the worst way possible the livelihood and the consumption of people.
Yeah, and هيدا concept the prestige of نحن عنا migrant worker بالبيت انه
او 2 او 3.
ايه انه اول شيء لشو عايزين 2 migrant worker، لشو عايز يعني بتصير هي مثل ما قلت ماركر لسوشيال ستاتس اكثر من ما يعني مش اكثر من ما مساعده. اوكي اكيد انه المايجرنت وركر عم تعمل اشغال بالبيت، يمكن تقدر المراه تروح هي تشتغل منها لحالها كذا هيك، بس كمان في كونسبت البرستيج انه لانه انا عندي حدا بيساعدني بالبيت يمكن I'm not as worse off as let's say we go back to the point of هيدا اللي بيعطيني الساندويش ببربر. فدايما في هيدا around all these different solutions there's this underlying انه social issue, social problem of not wanting to seem that we're not doing okay, then that has other like implications, I guess. You know, we'd have to admit that we need help. Exactly.
There's a shame, internalized shame related to being poor or not making it in life.
Exactly.
And honestly, that's what we talked about throughout this in terms of public problems but private solutions is the mantra of capitalism. If you leave it to work naturally, that's what happens really, because it's the idea that it's your private property that determines the outcomes of your life and how good of a lifestyle you can have, or you know how much disposable income, what your level of education and health is, etc. So like when we talk about class, it's really not level of income right now and how much your salary is. It's so many different things that are collaborating into having a certain standard of living. It matters in like how many languages you know, whether you know musical instruments, whether you've been to a good university or a university that trains you on certain things. So it matters in your whole life. It shapes your whole experience. Your class shapes your life, basically. That's what I'm saying. So yeah.
Yeah, so class shapes everything. It also shapes ideology.
Yeah.
So with everything that has happened in the past few years, be it the revolution, October 2019, the counter-revolutionary movements that came afterwards, how do you think people's ideology has shifted or changed as a result of all these different events, as a result of the economic crisis?
Yeah. So I think when we all realized that the economic model is collapsing, there was a mix of many things, right? Many people who know that this economic model was really, you know, inefficient, corrupt, etc., and also like very, very unfair, we're happy to see it kind of at the edge of its, the verge of collapsing, in the sense of like, we need to change. We need structural changes in the economy. We need to probably like, you know, send a few bankers to jail and close their institutions because of what they've practically done, etc. We need to do many things that could have, yani, it's not like, you know, ما في شيء self-evident, and that's the main issue, that we think that you know, this misery is just acceptable because, you know, الحالة صعبة and the situation is in general is like uncontrollable, but it's not. It's few policies that usually deal with this stuff. So that's why a lot of people saw the clear symptoms of an economic collapse as a moment for revolting. Progressive actors in general in society had been pushing and talking about a lot of things, right? Especially in terms of economic inequality, in terms of better policies, less corruption, whatever. But you reach a point where everyone suddenly wants to listen to an extent. At the end of this, at the end of the first few years, let's say, of complete inaction and like, let's say, stagnation at the level of government and level of policy, etc., you got an uprising, the October 17 uprising, right? And that to me is like the revolutionary answer to the economic crisis and the political crisis, because there's the same kind of economic and political crisis are not really different here. So the answer, the revolutionary answer was, we need to basically change the people in power. That's what everyone almost agreed on. And some people went a bit more in a more nuanced direction of saying what kind of alternative system they wanted to see. Some people talked about more socialist alternatives, and others about more liberal alternatives, even more liberal and more capitalist than it is the case in Lebanon. And that's fair, because that's a moment of debate, and that's how history happens. Okay, let's say. But at the same time, it's the economic crisis and collapse is not only an opportunity for revolt. It's also an opportunity for people who have been in power, benefiting from a system for so many years, to make a transition into the next thing. So if the system is collapsing, it doesn't mean that it's not going to be there in a few years. Its shape, its features will be a bit different. So for example, you might not be able to make money from the exact same industry that you used to make a few years ago in the same scale. So you need to find another industry, let's say. So maybe you see a lot around you. It's very, very common to see friends and people who have a bit of money, like starting restaurants and starting pubs. Still in the middle of the crisis, we had a boom in like new restaurants and new pubs and stuff like that. Why is that the case? Because it's seen as the fastest way to make money. So you see a lot of that going there. And capitalists, this is how they deal. The difference between two capitalists in a crisis is basically the problem, is the central, it's the best example of how capitalism works. The crisis happens, and then you have two shops, right? One or two companies. One that says, okay, things are expensive, things are unstable, I'll minimize, I'll downsize, so I'll minimize costs as much as possible, I'll fire people, etc. And another company that says, oh, wages are lower, let me actually invest much more, hire way more people, dominate the market, get a bigger market share, and then win. And that's what Totters did. Totters was not a significant actor so much a few years ago when Zomato was here, because there was a directory of all restaurants. Now Totters is the de facto monopoly in most major cities in Lebanon, because it's the delivery service that everyone kind of has access to, and most restaurants are on, and most workers can just subscribe by going there and like signing a paper, getting a bag and a t-shirt, and that's it. There's no labor contract, there's no demand, there's no social security, it's not a real formal job. You don't get paid unless you deliver food, so that's why they wait under bridges, so that they are close to getting the next order, so that they deliver the next order and get the income. So it's not even capitalism, it's a form of share crop, like same way as used to like share crops, like طلع تفاح بتعطي منهم للإقطاعي والباقي لإلك. هون انه ما طلع تفاح لانه ما اجى اوردر يعني basically, so ما بيطلع لي شيء. So basically ما في actually حتى عدد ساعات, it's not, they are not proletariat in the sense, they are not selling their hours for money, they are selling their potential deliverables, like their services, which is something that people who have been freelancers or worked in this sector of like freelance work, they know these words so much, like deliverables. Why? Because it's a different way of working. Instead of actually getting a stable income that's secure and based on a contract, now it depends on how much you actually manage to work or to do in a certain day or in a certain hour. So it's outside of your control as a worker. New system of like modern, I don't know what you call it, like feudal work relation that kind of was born on a big scale in the crisis, and many companies are replicating it now. Crazy. I mean, for me, it's a terrible direction to take. These jobs are very insecure and really like low paid. And Totters has been a really bad employer in terms of the amounts they give and the percentage they give to workers. And that's why we saw many strikes. And generally, the economy is going in that direction. So we will see, I think, more and more of these unfair businesses that are growing just to make fast money as much as they can, and they don't mind firing half of the workers when they need to, because they don't have real commitments to them. And this applies to even supermarkets that don't have formal employees, and big companies that employ daily workers on a daily level, etc. So a lot of people have benefited from the crisis by investing more, by using the crisis as an opportunity for them to make more money, mostly by exploiting the fact that wages are low. So different capitalists have gone different directions, and most business owners, their main reaction to the crisis has been leaving the country. If they're not here, if they're not active here or committed to, for example, political stuff here or family stuff that they can't get out of, they're usually leaving the country, going to Dubai or to other places where they can start this same company there and provide the same service, etc. And other capitalists are actually more involved in this transition towards the next thing in the system, in the economic model, by actually influencing policy directly. So, for example, we get the phenomenon of Antoun Sahnawi, who is primarily a banker, head of SGBL, right? Société Générale in Lebanon. But also, he funds journalists. He funds 7 MPs in parliament. There are 7 MPs on his payroll.
Wow.
Across different political groups, including people like Nadim Jmail and Jnoud Al Rab in Beirut, people like Raji Saad and Jumblat's list, Wael Abu Faour and the Beqa, also Jumblat's person, people like Michel Mawa, you know, the people that Anton Sahnawi, this wanted banker, basically, that's how people know him, like shady whatever banker, who has been subjected to many cases in the past.
He's currently in one, I believe.
Yeah. So نفس الشخص كمان هو, for example, involved in funding cinema movies, let's say, producing art, right? He's funding MPs. He has this business that's basically confiscating people's money and overcharging them for services. And now we saw that he's like casually funding a paramilitary, let's say, or like, let's say a mob of people, a fundamentalist mob of people, of Christian macho men who believe that, you know, the reaction to any progress that has been made by women and queer people, let's say generally, is to say that this is one of the main issues, one of the main reasons for the social collapse. Mm-hmm. So instead of focusing on the material collapse, which would actually lead them to a blame towards, to pointing the blame to their boss, who's one of the main people who benefited from this terrible economic model and is trying to, and has stolen people's money as any other bank owner, right? So this person who's funding them is the kind of the manifestation of the crisis. Him himself as a phenomenon is the counter-revolution in the crisis. He's in power through MPs and through his own bank, which is a very prominent one. He's trying to maintain his position. He knows that he needs to diversify his investments so that in one way or another, he's able to survive and maintain his power and status in the country on the long term, even if he loses one side of his. So that's the kind of people that kind of are the heart of what we say the counter-revolution. At the same moment where people are saying we want a different country, a more fair country, etc., you have this phenomena of many different actually organizations across the country that are mostly unemployed men looking for work that turns into, you know, turns into fundamentalist group. And also we saw that in other countries. It's not a special thing in Lebanon.
Yeah, it's not an exceptionist thing, but also it's a very important thing to talk about.
Yeah.
I wanted to just comment on the whole Anton Sahnawi thing, and him being so involved in the arts. It shows how everything in the country is very interconnected. So the economy is connected to politics, which is connected to art, because many people might think art is a very independent sector of everything that's happening in the country. بس this comes to show إنه ليه هو involved بهالسكتر من الأساس، لأنه بتبين قد إيه مهم يكون عندك إيديك بكل شيء تقدر تتحكم بكل شيء. وكمان مثلا مع جنود الرب اللي هلا we've seen them rise more, especially with, you know, their latest attack in Mar Mikhail, and them blaming these different communities, whether it be women, whether it be migrant workers, refugees, LGBTQ plus members, individuals, like they're blaming the crisis on them. But this is a grade A tactic that's used by these people in power, by the ruling class, to pit all these different communities that are being affected, that are being squashed, to pit them against each other, so they don't really focus on what's really happening. And so, we have to speak about how Jnoud Al Rab is a fundamentalist group that really is scary and is regressive, and you know, it does how do you say this, threaten this sense of freedom that many people thought they had to a certain extent, because we can't talk about freedom in Lebanon as it being an abundant thing, because it is far from being abundant. But we can't look at them as just إنه غنم. إنه كلمة غنم وقت في عالم كتير تستعمل كلمة غنم واستمعناها كتير، ويمكن أنا وقت كنت أصغر كمان كنت استعمل كلمة غنم، إنه كنت أعصب على العالم كيف they can support these political parties that are squashing us. But at the end of the day, it results from these economic conditions. So I would like us to talk about the relation between economic, I guess, misery, or at a loss of a better word now, and how it affects الانتساب يعني affects these members people in the working class وكيف بشدهم ينتسبوا على هيك groups.
Yeah, it's good not to make an association that is too let's say theoretical in the sense of, for example, people were really shocked that middle class, perceived as middle class young people from Europe were traveling to fight for Daesh. You know, if you remember that time, people were really shocked, like, شو جابرك? Why would you go all the way to Iraq to fight, or to Syria to fight for this group when you've grown on very different values and different society, all of these things. Some of them were not Christian before, they were not Muslim, they converted to Islam and then they did this. So the idea that only poor people can be fundamentalists is totally wrong.
Okay.
But the idea that unemployed people or people who are poor and are more dependent on charity in general and clientelism as structure in Lebanon are more prone to being fundamentalists is because of what these experiences entail. So let's say you have children and you want them to go to an activity center, okay, and you have two options. One of them is connected to a political party, it's really cheap, everyone goes there, or sometimes it's completely free, and then your kids can spend their time there without you worrying about the cost of their whole day during summer, for example, or one day in each of their weekends. I'm giving you an example. So you send them to Kashaf al-Mahdi. Are you a fundamentalist? Maybe not. Are you even religious? Probably yes, but maybe not, right? So maybe like Khalas in one of the scouts, right? And then you think about school, and it's very similar. It's like, where should I so for example, with the case of Hezbollah, we saw how establishing a fundamentalist ideology requires you to have these communal organizations or this communal presence, and there's been books written on this in Lebanon on how clientelism is reproduced and stuff like that. But the main thing for me is that basically political choices are sometimes, or social positions are sometimes really dependent on who you're surrounded with and the people you've interacted with, and a lot of times people who have offered opportunities or services or charity have the worst ideology, like in terms of, at least how I see it, like for example the idea that always fundamentalism is kind of always related to religion, right? We take that for granted, but like we can see different fundamentalisms that are 100%. Secular. We can see completely secular fundamentalism, but based on other forms of fundamentalism, like believing that, it's not about religion, but maybe one race is better than the other, maybe, whatever, for whatever reason. You might have different reasons. You might have historical, geographic, racial, whatever conceptions of the difference between peoples, but you can have fundamentalism that's not related to religion. But most of the cases, it's been Christian or Muslim fundamentalism or Jewish fundamentalism, right? And when a lot of these organizations, institutions that spread this religion and manage it go further into this direction, a lot of its members are more and more conservative, more and more, strict and rigid about religion. You're expecting to see a certain social transformation happening on the long term, and that's why a lot of people who live in communities where there are notable, for example, religious people, imam or khore, etc., hasab where, they know that they can't really trust this person politically. They know that this person بينحكى عن شيء اسمه الشنطة, اللي هو like, in general, it's like who gets paid to say things. من وين عم يجوا المصاري, that's channeling this sudden rage that this religious person has against whatever people, whatever community, insert blank, in this Friday or Sunday. Why is this person suddenly talking about how we should dehumanize gay people? What happened? Some people told him to say so, and we should remember that it's not all gradual, it's not all organic, it's not all natural and spontaneous.
Yeah,
people on the right, people on the extremist side of the fundamentalism spectrum, let's say, are active, are doing things. Jnoud Al Rab are actively recruiting people. They are paying people.
They have a Twitter account. They have an Instagram account.
Yeah. And they have many groups that we don't know about that through which they kind of do this. But they are getting primarily like they're getting money, and they're getting like, you know, some sense of fascist camaraderie in this whole thing that they are eager for, because capitalism alienates us to the point where you feel like it's either me personally going to solve this or some sort of like a collective, right? So this collective can be a great thing, and it can be a mob depending on your circumstances, but also depending on who's able to fund your life so that you have this choice. انه اذا عم تاخدي منحة لتروحي تتعلمي بالاتحاد السوفيتي like many people in Lebanon did when many parties in Lebanon were connected to the USSR, it's a different experience than, you know, relying on Hezbollah schools and unis or whatever. You know, like you're gonna get different education. You will be basically a different person with different understanding of reality.
Okay.
If you grow up in completely different like ideological environment. But there is an overarching ideology, I think, all of the really reactionary anti-progressive actors in Lebanon, which is most political parties, most social groups connected to religious institutions, etc. They all share certain the things that they have in common, let's say, is basically the ideology of capitalism, the ideology of the market. And the things that they disagree on is something about identity primarily, and about other things like geopolitical head. But it's fascinating because then you don't have left and right in practice. You have right and right.
صح.
And you're just choosing based on your own religion, which you can't really control. So it's a great way of like make sure that people fall in line. So بفهم ليش حدا بيقول اوكي غنم، بس انه غنم is like a different species. We're humans who have been indignified in a way where we've been reliant on other humans and other organizations who can basically manipulate our choices in life and politically based on our needs. So it's a socio-economic issue and a social issue that needs another opportunity to remember that a social problem needs a social solution. If it's fragmented, then it can lead to all these different answers, you know.
Yeah, I think, you know, we can say this as a final note, is that community really matters, and understanding what another person is dealing with and why they're dealing with this certain situation helps you, I guess, not to be very cheesy, but, you know, unite better in face of these oppressive powers, in face of this ruling class that at the end of the day perceives these different people, whether they be in these different social classes, socio-economic classes, you know, they perceive them as puppets. And once there's this realization of that, no matter how hard it gets to get to that point and realize it is a game to them, you know, that's when we can truly move in a different direction. And some people are doing this, it's just the fragmentation makes it hard.
Yeah.
But anyway, I want to thank you so much for coming and talking to us here. It was really fun.
It's my pleasure.
And I want to remind everyone to like, subscribe, and follow our YouTube channel and our socials. Thank you.